Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third in our Deeper Dive series, A Beacon of Hope. This series is a part of an exhibition we have at the museum right now called Heroine of the Titanic. And to tell you a little bit about it is the director of the museum, Andrea Malcolm.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you especially to Adrian and Angela for being our guests tonight. This is all a part of our Deeper Dive series connecting to our Heroine of the Titanic exhibit, which runs through September 25th and really looks at the story of Mrs. Brown's Titanic experience through the eyes of her fellow passengers, those who were on the ship with her, those who survived, those who did not, and then sort of what happened in the aftermath. So, and how we remember and memorialize those who were lost. So we're really taking a deep dive into the stories of those who are on the ship, and that's who we're going to learn about tonight. So I'm so grateful to have Adrian and Angela with us. And if you have the opportunity, please visit the museum and see our exhibit and some of the artifacts that have come to the museum for the very first time, like Mrs. Brown's Egyptian talisman.
And I just want to say how very grateful we are for having Adrian and Angela join us tonight. We're really happy to have them as part of this series. A quick housekeeping note. If you would like to ask either Angela or Adrian a question while they're doing their presentations, please put those questions in the chat and we will get to them. At the very least, we will make sure we answer them when they finish speaking. So just remember, anything you want to say, go ahead and put it in the chat. And we're going to get started first with Angela Locascio, who is a published author who is also a Titanic descendant and works with the Titanic Memorial Lighthouse. And she has written a book about two relatives, brothers that were on Titanic, the Paraccio brothers, and I'm going to turn it over to her to let her tell her story.
Hello, Kim. Hello, Andrea, and hello, everyone who has joined. Hello, Adrian. Hello, everyone who has joined us on this beautiful event. I am so pleased and honored to be a part of this event. Margaret Tobin Brown is one of my heroes in life. She, like me, started her education a little bit on the older side, and she's an activist, and she works with many children. She worked with many children in her day to help them strive for better education and a higher education. And I am so grateful for her story and her heroine, her ship on the Titanic. But my story is about my uncles that I came to tell. I am not related by blood to Alberto and Sebastiano Paraccio. I am their niece through marriage. A little bit of a background how this story happened. I was 19 years old and I went to visit my soon-to-be uncle, Zio Modesto Paraccio, and his beautiful wife, Angela. We had a lovely dinner, and we were just talking about my husband and I, and they told me their stories about growing up in Fubina, Alessandria, Italy, and how they immigrated to Italy and found a wonderful life in America. Well, after dinner, they decided to have dessert in their family room. And I walked in, and on the side, on the credenza, was a picture about this big of Titanic. It was the black and white version of the Titanic leaving Cherbourg for the last time. And on the side were two small cameo pictures of two very handsome young men. So under my breath, I said the word Titanic. And Zio, at the time I was calling him Mr. Paraccio, he just looked at me and said, "What do you know about Titanic?" And he was so excited just to hear someone say the name by just looking at the ship. And I said to him, I just studied about her in high school, And I wrote a paper about her. And then I had said, well, uh, I'm also one of those people that read stories about her and just fell in love with her. Well, you know more than me, he said. And he said, well, what more do you know? And I just, gave a summary of what I remembered when I was 17 in high school, and that it was from Southampton, and the day it sailed and the day she died, and the usual things that when you're a beginner historian. Well, he looked at me, and I'll never forget the face on him. This man was such a gentle soul. He looked at me and with his deep sea blue eyes and said, "Can you help me find my brothers?" And I just went, "What?" I said, "What do you mean? I'm not even your niece. I'm not family." And he looked at me and he said, "By the way, my nephew and you look at each other, you're in love, and I know you'll be married." And I looked at him, and I was so nervous at the time because I kept thinking, supposing something happened, I was also a kid. I was 19. Well, his wife, Zia Ann, comes in with the dessert and the coffee. And of course, it's an Italian household. So it's more like the Phoenician hour at a wedding in this house. And he started telling me about his brothers as they were growing up in Italy. And before you knew it, I just looked at this man and I saw this pain in his face, as though what happened to them. And I could not say anything but, "Yes, I'll help you." And I did not realize at that particular moment, until I was much, and I started writing my book and I started writing all the notes down, how much Titanic has such an influence on someone from literally the day one you set eyes upon her or you read her story. I I did not realize how much she was going to wrap her wind sails around me and take me down to the abyss with her in search of the great divide of what happened to her. And from then on, I searched every book I could find. I asked family members. And, you know, back in the day in 1978, 79, when in the beginning of when I started my search, there wasn't much to go by. There really wasn't. I mean, there was microfiche, there was some books written by Titanic historians, but not really enough that told the perfect truth about what was going on. I mean, don't get me wrong, Walter Lord wrote magnificent books, and there were others that wrote books, but there weren't books that were giving me the lead that I needed to find my uncles. But one day, I purchased a book in Barnes and Noble called Titanic Triumph and Disaster by Charles Haas and John P. Eaton. May John rest in peace. And I began reading it. And all I remember is my uncle had said to me that the boys worked in a restaurant. They worked in a restaurant. Alberto worked in a restaurant on the Olympic on Titanic's sister ship. So maybe he was working in a restaurant on Titanic. He wasn't quite sure because the family kept everything hush hush. On page 93, I will never forget reading on page 93 of Charles Haas's book about Luigi Gotti and the restaurant that he was served on Titanic. And he spoke about the crew, and he talked about other issues of the story about how they served the first class dining and how the menu was different from the first class dining salon, which was all inclusive in the ticket for the deck, for their cabins and such. But then I'm reading, could it possibly be that this is where my uncles worked? So then I started press really harder in the family members. And I finally found my cousin Eva, who was Uncle Giorgio's daughter, Uncle Giorgio Paracchio, one of the other brothers of the Paracchio's family. And Eva finally gave me a list of names, finally gave me some whereabouts in Italy where the boys lived, and finally told me that Alberto lived in England with Luigi and was being schooled there. That was all I needed. So in Charles' book, I wrote a letter to Lord Lewin, who was at the time, the president of the Maritime Museum in Southampton, England. And I asked him for some information. He was very gracious and sent me a letter and sent me information about the a la carte restaurant, where I could find more information. I went into some of the databases and found out that my uncles lived on 4 Dean Street, London in Surrey. It was like everything from then on was steamrolling, and I was able to start finding more information, where they were, you know, how they started working on the ship, why the school in England was so important for, you know, for restaurateurs. And then I found my uncles, and I started finding their names on rosters and finding their names in books. Like one of the books I was so surprised in is I had met G. Michael Harris in the Titanic, the exhibition. And I bought a book there of the exhibition. And in the back were all the names of the passengers and crew. And in that book, there were my uncle's names. And it was just fantastic. It was just a wonderful find. But then I also started meeting some wonderful people through Facebook. I joined some Titanic groups. And on those groups, in that group, I met Jill Collier, who is the president of the Titanic Book Club on Facebook. I met Dee Ryan Meister and her husband, Neil. We became friends. And with Dee, we was talking about me writing a book, and I had no idea that she and her husband were in publishing. And they offered their assistance. And from there on, everything seemed to just open up. I was invited to Halifax. I couldn't go the first time around, but I went the next time. I was able to get the rest of the information I needed from Richard McMichael, who was the senior interpreter for the Titanic Maritime Museum of Atlantic Canada. And it was just a dream come true to be in Halifax with Dee and with the rest of the society, that it made me realize how real Titanic was. And when I went to and forgive me, I'm getting very emotional, but when I went to the Fairview Lawn Cemetery and I put my hand on Luigi Gotti's gravestone, I was home. For the first time, from the time I was 19, and I'm sorry, I get very emotional at this point. All I remember is Dee was standing right in back of me. And we had just come from the public gardens for the 150th anniversary of Titanic. We were in period costume. And when Dee put her arm on my shoulder, I just gave her the biggest hug. I said, I'm home. I am home. I mean, even if my uncles aren't here because they were never found, I'm home. I'm with their boss. I'm here. And it was one of the most wonderful feelings, even though it was very sad to be in this cemetery and to be among all those who perished on Titanic. I felt like my Uncle Modesto was with me. I felt like all his brothers and sisters were with me. And at that moment, if anyone believes in this, I could feel Zio Alberto here and Zio Sebastiano here. They were there. Like, you found us. You found us finally, and we're here. So meeting Dee was such a wonderful treasure. And then everything spearheaded to meeting Jill and meeting Adrian and becoming part of this family deeper and deeper in the dive of the search for Titanic. But I want to introduce you, as since I've been talking about them so much. These are my uncles. This is Sebastian, this is Alberto, and this is Sebastiano. This picture came from Italy, and on the bottom, it says Alberto e Sebastiano Paracchio, Digiuti del naufragio del Titanic 14 April 1912, which means that they died on that day on Titanic. And Adrian loves when I tell this story because it gets very personal. The bow tie that Alberto was wearing and the flower that Sebastiano was wearing was made by grandma. And Noni had told them, please wear it anytime you take pictures or anytime you are happy, because I want to know that my sons are happy. And I've heard this story through my cousin Eva, who told me. So when right here at this point, these pictures were taken in the back of the a la carte restaurant on the aft deck. And you could tell the background's a little bit blurry, but you could see maybe some of the flowers in it from the wallpaper. But when these pictures were sent home, even before, Titanic sank, Grandma knew that her boys were okay. Everything was fine. They were happy. And then we all know what happened on April 14th, 1912. Fate saw her to find her end in her maiden voyage, and my uncles went down with her.
And Angela, how old were they?
So, actually, Alberto, I'll pick up the picture one. Alberto here turned 20 years old on April 7th, 1912. He celebrated his 20th birthday on the ship while he was getting the ship outfitted for the provisions at the a la carte. Sebastiano here would have been 18 May 7th, 1912. Unfortunately, he died right before his 17th birthday, so close to it. And Titanic, before I forget, this is the book that I wrote, Titanic, The Brothers Paracchio, Two Boys in a Dream. And it's written under my pen name, Angelica Harris, which is my branding name and most of the time where I'm known, but my real name is Angela Filomeno Locascio. I come from a very big Italian family. But I know I could show pictures and such, and from the book, I don't want to run out of time because I see that we do have, Adrian needs to get into his, I'm sorry, I'm flubbing my words a little bit, but I do have an announcement, and it's with permission from Helen Benzinger. With the Titanic Memorial Lighthouse, I am honored and privileged to be able to be the founder of the Margaret Tobin Brown Educational Foundation for Children. And with that educational foundation, we are going to work within the Titanic Memorial Lighthouse, once it's built, God willing, to put a center there. Not only are we going to have our museum and our conference rooms and such, but it is my dream to put a center there for children to learn, to have, to be able to come and get help, to receive help, in education, but also to learn about the Titanic, the passengers, the crew, how she was built. Also, maritime history and lighthouse history. What a joy to bring this to children. and to have speakers come in and speak to them. I mean, it's my honor and privilege to, to announce that. And let's hope anyone who is listening, please help us, raise money to do so, because Margaret Tobin Brown's legacy needs to move forward, as she is the founder of the Lighthouse, of so many wonderful things for children. So I thank you so much for listening tonight. And again, it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. And thank you for sharing your announcement during this presentation. It's so very special for the museum. Thank you. We're going to switch now to Adrian Sager. He is the representative of the Titanic Memorial Lighthouse, and he has all kinds of amazing information to share with you. And again, if you have questions for Adrian as he's doing this, please just go ahead and throw them in the chat, and we'll be sure that he hears of them and answers those questions for you.
Thank you, Kim. Welcome, friends. I see a few friend faces here. Jill from Titanic Book Club, great to see you. Oh, they're all moving around. Hey, how are you, Dee, from Titanic Society Atlantic Canada, who tend the graves in Halifax to this day, and for that, we thank them. And a few other friends, I see Pat there. Thank you for your likes on Facebook. I guess before I start, I just want to acknowledge that Titanic Memorial Lighthouse does sit on tribal lands, and at the corner of Pearl Street and Water Street, where the Lapane Mannahatta tribe were living for many, many centuries. And we are honored to have the lighthouse on that space. So we'll acknowledge that before we begin. I have a presentation for you this evening, which deals with a lot of the history, but also some of the nuts and bolts of what we're doing to restore this. It's a challenging project, but one we embrace and enjoy. And we hope to have some good news for you in the coming weeks regarding that. We had a very great meeting today, and hopefully some news will come from that. So we'll move forward to this first slide if we could, Kim. So there we go. So this is a really important building in the history of New York. It's, as you see, one of the tallest buildings on the west side. It was designed by Warren and Wetmore, who are the architects of Grand Central Station. That's their architectural sketch drawing there in the top right. And what's interesting about this photograph, it's a beautiful photograph, is the perspective that it gives you on the Brooklyn Bridge in the far distance there, and the masts of the tall ships, which is where the Seaport District stands today. But if you look at the top of the lighthouse, you'll see a man standing there in a white shirt. And that gives you sort of some idea of the scale of this lighthouse. We'll come to its height and whether it's possibly the tallest lighthouse in America later in the day. But on the top there, you'll see the time ball, and we'll talk about that later in the day. But it's extremely significant. And the paradox about this lighthouse is that not only a memorial to the dead, it actually saved lives too. What I'd like you to imagine from this particular photograph is that the ball dropped at noon. It was called a time ball, and everyone doing their work on the street there or in the harbor on the ships pulled out their pocket watches and set the time on those devices. And it's essentially how New York kept time in the pre-quartz, pre-digital era. So it's really significant for business meetings and for safe navigation. Next slide, please.
I apologize for my terrible slide driving. It's super touchy, and I keep skipping your slide and I don't know how to make it stop. There you go.
Okay, great.
Was that the one?
Yeah, this is fine. It's a city landmark. Again, another really terrific perspective for the history buffs here. Of course, you know, we can see the East River in the distance there, and all the maritime work that went on in the harbor in that era. You know, it's not with us today, but we still have the remnants of that in the Titanic Lighthouse. The photograph, you'll see the time ball has actually dropped from its high point into the cupola. So that tells us that it's past noon. I think the shadows in the photograph tell us that too, but it's just past noon. So everyone knows it's past midday. And on the right here, you can see some early parts of the construction in 1912. I will add that there was always a plan to build a lighthouse on this particular building, which is the Seamen's Church Institute. And it was dedicated, or decided to be dedicated, to the victims of Titanic on the very day that Titanic sank. And it was unveiled exactly a year after the sinking in 1913. And it was the world's first memorial to the Titanic victims.
Sorry.
There's one just in there about, is this the next one? There we go, the horological device. I think that would be the next one. So, as I alluded earlier, this was a big clock. As I said, in the time before people didn't have, you know, our smartphones and these devices, this is a device that everyone could see at a distance. Now, you'll notice the time ball is actually painted black for sight at distance, and it was wrapped in black leather. And I believe this gentleman up here in the middle photograph has actually been painting it, believe it or not. But you can see the three positions. 5 minutes before noon, the time ball is raised. At noon, the ball drops. Exactly at noon, it just drops. And that's its final lowered position. Now, if we restore this to its original condition, as we intend to, it will be America's only working time ball. There are a couple of others. There's one at Plymouth Light, but it doesn't work. There's one at the US Naval Observatory, which is a replica. And there's also one in Times Square, and it's called the Ball Drop. It predates this one by a few years. It was actually inaugurated by Adolph Ochs, the owner of the New York Times, in 1907. So we're in good company with this ball drop. There's one actually in between that. It's at the US Coast Guard one, Kim. Maybe if you take it off full screen, that might work better. I don't know. Well, the one that we missed was that it was an official US CG Coast Guard for the port of the city of New York. And if you were crossing the Atlantic, the first light you would see on approaching the United States was the Ambrose Lighthouse in the Ambrose Channel. And you took a hard left at that lightship and you made for the Titanic Lighthouse. And it was active for 1913 to 1968. So it's a really significant piece. These three lamps were visible all the way down at Sandy Hook, which is a good sort of 15 miles distant. And it was a green light, a very unique color for lighthouses around the United States. And of course, we don't need lighthouse lights today. We all have GPS. But I think if you're coming up through the Narrows in a fog, you might just like to see a green light shining out over New York City.
Mm-hmm.
So annual remembrance, was something that took place every year for many years on the anniversary of the sinking, and Friends of Titanic Lighthouse have pursued or reinstated that service for the last 3 years. We're very proud to be part of that. And in fact, last year we laid wreaths, and societies from all around the world also laid wreaths. And we hung a banner on the memorial. And that would be the first time that names of all the victims had been placed on the memorial since it was constructed. So we feel it's really important that they have a more permanent place on the memorial that we hope to restore. We're fast forwarding here to the 50s, 40s and 50s, and you can see the FDR Drive has been built, and you know, things have changed. Buildings have risen all around our, you know, once the tallest building on the east side. Lighthouses weren't quite so functional and important in this era, and the Siemens Church Institute decided that they were going to demolish this beautiful building, and sadly it was torn down in 1968. And to put it in historical perspective, this was 3 years after Penn Station had been destroyed, sadly, and this is when the beginnings of saving architectural heritage began in the United States. And I happen to believe that this was saved as a direct result of Penn Station and the you know, dismay that everyone had at tearing down this beautiful building. So in 1968, it was demolished, and the next slide shows you what was left of it. You know, it's pretty sad condition, sad to say. We don't know what happened to the gallery or the gantry, but we feel that its meaning is as important as the structure itself, what it stands for. In 1976, it was put on a concrete plinth, paid for by, of all people, the Exxon Foundation. And it was moved to its current position in Titanic Memorial Park. And you can see it there with the wreaths and the names of the victims that we placed on there just last year. So what do we want to do? That's the history. How do we save this magnificent object for future generations? Well, our vision is to restore it to its 100% working condition, record and remember the victims, recognize a state and national historic landmark, create a top 10 tourist attraction that financially supports the struggling Seaport Museum, and create a beacon of hope, as we're calling it, for youth, immigrants, and visitors. We're in the New York Times just last weekend. I'm very happy to be in it. On the top there is a quote from Angelica. For those who don't have a grave, let this be their grave. The quote in the center quote was given to Helen Benziger, appropriately enough. And she said, like their graves have not been tended, which is a very strong headline for the New York Times. They don't generally take positions on architecture, but I think this was a very clear message to us that they believe it's overdue for restoration. Some other quotes here. Tried James Cameron. Yes, we already did. He didn't get back to us. Next slide, please. So this is on the left where it currently stands, and on the right what we hope to restore it to. I won't spend too much time on the elements here. I'm sure you can go through them and see all the different pieces. But structurally, what we like to do is restore it to its original condition, and that means remaking the gallery and the gantry in wrought iron from period plans, sourcing the brickwork, firing the brickwork and the mortar to make it as close to we possibly can make it to what it stood in 1913. So how do we go about doing that? We were given a very significant vote by Community Board 1. They gave us a 46-0 unanimous decision for in situ restoration. anyone who's had anything to do with the New York City community boards knows that you don't get a 46-0 vote on anything. So they were sending us a very clear message that they want this fixed and immediately. So we'd have to tent the structure in situ on the corner of Pearl and Water Street. As I said, we design and fabricate the wrought iron from period plans. We'd have to overhaul the time ball mechanism, strip the paint from the cupola and the dome and refurbish that. Source and find the 3 Cooper Hewitt lamps, who is related to Cooper Hewitt, by the way, of New York City Museum, and fire the brickwork per the original. Once that's complete, and we hope by April 15, 2024, we'll have a rededication service, and the structure will be unveiled and people will be able to access it, and the ball will drop and the light will shine and the names will at last be recorded. We're really pleased and honored to have some terrific letters of support here for our landmarking appeal. It currently is a New York City landmark because it is in a landmark district. However, it's not on the state and national list of historic places. We feel it's significant enough to be a state and national landmark. The process is, it's nominated, it goes to state, then it goes to national landmark conditions. So we have Congressman Nadler, State Senator Kavanaugh, a letter from the president of the 9/11 Museum Memorial, and on the right there is from Princess Electra Marconi, who is a strong supporter, 94 years young. And for those who don't know her story, Marconi was supposed to sail on Titanic, but he chose to not go and sail on Olympic. He would no doubt have perished, and she would have been in a lifeboat, but they chose to go on Olympic on a later crossing. So she is a strong supporter, and we're truly honored to have her as part of our group. We've received 21,000, almost 22,000 signatures to make it a National Historic Landmark. And this is on change.org, and some of the reasons for people signing, you can go and check it out, and maybe sign yourself if you haven't already. We have raised some money. This initial amount will go towards funding a conditions assessment report, which is a sort of a fundamental assessment of what's inside and outside, and a roadmap for restoration. We're triple bidding it, and we're transparent in the process. We will engage an architect to enter the structure and just see what's going on. No one's been in for 50 years. And that is the protocol for restoration, according to the Secretary of State. That's the process. And we hope to complete that in the coming month. We've been really honored to have the support of international societies, including the British Titanic Society, the Russian Titanic Society, and they've all said really terrific things. The Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada, and many more, in fact, than that. And it's an international project. It's an international memorial. Victims were from 28 nations. I mean, Swedish was the second most spoken language on Titanic, believe it or not. So we're really thrilled to have support from all these groups. Was it America's tallest lighthouse? Well, we recently uncovered documentation that showed that it was 216 feet above the high water mark, the tower that it was, in fact. America's current tallest lighthouse is Cape Hatteras. It's about 195 feet and change. We believe that with the time ball on top, this actually was America's tallest lighthouse. The official Coast Guard lighthouse for the port of the city of New York from, as you said, 1913 to 68. So wouldn't it be wonderful to restore it, put it back at its riverside position, at its historical height to signal maritime traffic, as was its historic function. Some other groups that have had great success restoring lamps. Here we are with the Grey Light in Belfast Harbour. It was unveiled in 2018. 200,000 people visit it a year. They've done a really remarkable job, but as you can see there, they've included the history, and this is part of their Maritime Mile, which we hope to replicate on the riverfront on the Seaport District in Manhattan. The Highline, this is a Highline opportunity, we believe. Highline was simply an elevated train track with a bunch of railway tracks, and now it sees 7, close to 10 million visitors a year, and buildings have sprung up all around it. We hope for a similar opportunity with Titanic Memorial Lighthouse. I do like this quote from the National Conference of State and Historic Preservation Officers. I'll let you read it. I would add that it takes money. And that, remember that Titanic is a phrase that perhaps some of us are familiar with. That was the fundraising slogan in 1912 for Titanic Memorial Lighthouse. And we aim to continue that legacy. Once repaired and restored, it will be the only working lighthouse in Manhattan, the only working time ball in the US, and the names of the victims will at last be recorded. People love this memorial, and we do too. We hope that they will come in droves when it's restored and learn about the history and the immigrants and the millionaires and the victims and the survivors. These are some of our social channels. If you're not already following us, please join and follow our progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adrian. I am sorry for flubbing a few of your slides there. I'm happy I got it under control. We do have some questions. And one of those, in one of your photos, Jill asked whose lifeboats are in the photo on the right. And I'm not sure, I can share screen again if we want to find the correct photo. But I'm not, do you know what she's talking about, or do we need to take a look?
Bit more specific, I'm not quite sure on that one.
Yeah, that's, Jill, do you want to add more to your comments? Her other question, maybe we can answer, and I know which photo she's talked about. She says, where did all those statues go? So there's that great picture from up next to the lighthouse, and you can see the statues.
That's a great question. Yes, I mean the eagle gargoyles, I think, is what is being referred to there. I honestly couldn't tell you. Wouldn't it be wonderful to find out where they went? In fact, who knows? There was a few of them. I've got a feeling that one might have remained in the possession of the Seamen's Church Institute. I couldn't tell you that for a fact, though.
Okay, and I'm just quickly looking through your photos to see if I can find the correct one very quickly. And I'll reshare the screen because I think I've got it here. Let's see. And Jill, you'll have to chime in, just tell us if this is the photo you were talking about. Was this the correct one? Are you talking about
this vessel here? This is unrelated to Titanic. This vessel, I mean, unfortunately, these photographs are in the Seamen's Church Institute archive, which I highly recommend everyone checking out, because there's some really remarkable photographs. Anyone's interested in maritime history, not just for Titanic Lighthouse. But this, unfortunately, is not credited. It looks like there's the Godafoss Island, and it looks like it's a Norwegian ship. I can see the flag on there, but I cannot tell you much more about it than that. I can tell you that it's past noon because time ball is down.
Well spotted. Does anyone else have any questions for either Angela or Adrian?
People are either putting things in the chat, or you're welcome to also maybe unmute and just ask your question directly. Adrian, is there any efforts to sort of connect some of the memorials and other locations in New York City that connect to the Titanic in any sort of digital or walking tour, or some way that connects those other sites in New York City related to Titanic?
Yeah, there's a couple of programs that I would draw your attention to. One is a gentleman called Dave Gardner, who does Titanic tours in New York. And he's one of our supporters. In fact, he came to the New York Times event, and when we were interviewed at the Lighthouse, and he gave a very nice speech about Titanic. And he does a tour of all the Titanic related locations in the city, Chelsea Piers and elsewhere. And that I would highly recommend. He's a really engaging guy, and it's definitely worth a trip. Regarding the other, excuse me, the other structures and memorials, of course, there's the Strauss Memorial, which is probably the most famous. I believe that's up in the 80s. We're actually in communication with members of the Strauss family, and they have supported us. But we haven't really made any further connection than that. I know for a fact they celebrate every year, and there are flowers, and some family members attend. But you know, we're supportive of them, and them of us likewise.
Jill asked another question. She wanted to know if the Seaport Museum came around after the New York Times article.
Well, we have requested, by we I mean our architects have requested access to the structure to begin the conditions assessment, and we have been told that the earliest that this will happen is the fall because of ongoing programming. We're disappointed that we've got to wait another 2 months when this is a relatively short period of time that we'd need to access. We're talking, 2 or 3 hours, perhaps, to look inside and just see what's there. But that's probably the best answer I could give to that one.
And she says she's also wondering if the folks who run the park around Pier 54 are interested in helping, or if they've been working with you.
I'm not familiar with that. I do know that Pier 54 now has Little Island, which was the Diller von Furstenberg designed garden, which is quite spectacular. I'm not sure how much consideration was given to the history of the White Star Line pier that was there, sadly. I think it was ignored, frankly. We feel that the right location is the seaport for the lighthouse, because historically it was down there. To move it to Pier 54, I think is not perhaps appropriate. But we're open to a conversation on that. We're leaning towards it being closer to the riverfront, down in the Seaport District, to signal river traffic down the Narrows, as was its original function.
Excellent. I don't see any more questions. I have my own question though, and I feel terrible asking this because I feel like it's a very ignorant question, but I didn't realize, and I just would like either you or Angela to confirm, that the Titanic victims, their names are not memorialized anywhere. I assume they were in Halifax. I see you both shaking your heads no, though.
No, it's a travesty. I mean, perhaps I'll let Angelica talk to that point, because the brothers' names are not listed, as are none of the other 1,496 victims.
No, I mean, in Halifax, there's of course the cemeteries. There are the 3 cemeteries, and each one of them have the Jewish cemetery, the Baron de Hirsch, the Christian cemetery, which is Fairview Lawn Cemetery. It's more like an interfaith cemetery. And then there's the Catholic cemetery, Mount Olivet. Many of the victims are buried there, and those who are identified have their names on it, and others just have a number. But the names are in, I believe, I know D is on, but the names are etched somewhere in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax, in the city of Halifax itself. But here in New York City, not one place do we have these names etched. There are plenty of tourist attraction areas. If you want, I mean, there's the Strauss Memorial, and there's on Pier 54, on the piers rather, there are plenty of plaques that depict the Titanic was here and other things. But to actually say their names are there, I can't go anywhere and find my uncle's names or find, I'll give you another thing. J.J. Astor, John Jacob Astor, our neighborhood here in Queens, New York is Astoria. It is named after him, yet his name is nowhere found on the Titanic roster as a victim. And his body was found a week later. I mean, if I remember my history correctly, and it touched me, his body was found on my birthday, April 23rd. But nowhere to be found is his name stated as, this is a victim of the Titanic. His family, holds the name of Astoria, Queens, New York. The family is prevalent with the significance of his death on the Titanic and what it did to the family. I mean, in all the movies, we see that he was married to a very young woman and she was pregnant with his child. But other than that, where does he stand? It's the same thing. We have the Guggenheim Museum right here in Manhattan, and it's one of the most famous museums. But the founder, now this is what gets me, its founder died on Titanic. Why is it that even in the museum, there isn't a plaque with every name of the victims of Titanic and the survivors? What happened? These are the pieces of the puzzle that Adrian and I are trying to put together here in New York, because when you think about Titanic was supposed to sail here. This is where she was about to end her maiden voyage. I mean, of all the places in the world, New York City, which is famous for its tourist attractions and sightseeing and its history, its great history, there's nothing here. I mean, it's lifeboats. I'm compelled to talk about them. They were being held in some of the sheds off the piers at one time. And then they disappeared. It was like, all of a sudden, all the lifeboats were gone. So if anyone went to find these lifeboats, but the other tragedy is that the numbers of the lifeboats and the insignia of the White Star Line was actually removed from them after a certain time while they stayed in the sheds, in the pier sheds, and then they disappeared. Where they go? Why are our artifacts disappearing? Especially in the greatest city in the United States, or as we're thought of, where are they? So Adrian and I are going to work on, and other historians and our descendant advocates, our descendants, we need to find out why. Why is New York City not doing anything? Why have they not in 110 years? As I said, and I'm getting very personal and very emotional again. when Adrian and I had our very first commemoration together, and I was able to put a wreath at the foot of the lighthouse, I felt like my uncles finally had a grave, finally had a place to be memorialized. I mean, you know, they weren't famous. They were simple young men who wanted a better life. But that was Titanic. She was bringing these people home to a new life. I mean, when you think about so many of the steerage passengers who died, these were people who needed a new home, who needed a new destination for better family life. I mean, and I'm talking also about my friend here, Adrian, who comes from England. I mean, you know, look at the life he found here in America. I mean, we need to share these stories, because we cannot have Titanic forgotten. You know, just like 9/11, we cannot have you know, the victims of 9/11 forgotten. And I lost two of my friends that day, and I will never forget them. They were good two, and again, young men. They were 27 and 34, and they worked on the 110th floor. I mean, let's bring Titanic Memorial Lighthouse to fruition. Let us bring her legacy and the legacy of her passenger and crew. And let us all just, you know, find a way of sharing the names of the people that we cannot forget and have been forgotten. So thank you for listening to my long commentary, but thank you.
That was beautifully put, Angela, and I think a sentiment we certainly share at the Molly Brown House Museum, and was the core theme behind our exhibit this year, was we all know about the unsinkable Margaret Tobin Brown, you know, as the heroine of the Titanic. We know her story, but we don't know the story of the Syrians on board. We don't know the story of the Swedish on board as the second, you know, biggest spoken language, and the Chinese passengers, you know, and all of those amazing immigrants coming to the United States, you know, to start a new life. And it was an emigrant ship. And so, you know, like your family members and like so many of the people we know and hear about, it's their stories that really reflect who we are as a country, you know, and who we're made up of. So I think one of the questions I always like to turn around and ask is, why do you think the Titanic, Adrian, Angela, is so compelling to us still 110 years later?
Well, I'll let Angela finish, but I was asked that question by John Gill of the New York Times. And I know when I'm getting asked a big question. And I did pause for a bit and I said, John, you know, a lot of books have been written on that topic. But my personal take on it is that it raises the everlasting existential question of, what would I have done? Would I have, as a man, elected to go down with the ship, as many men did? Would I have attempted to get into a lifeboat or been offered a lifeboat? As a woman, would I have stayed with my husband, as the Strausses did? Would I have got into a lifeboat and left my husband on deck? I mean, these are, you know, real life questions when you're on the deck of a sinking ship. And I think that's what holds the fascination for so many people about the real life story, and the movie too, is that brought it to life, is that very human question.
For me, searching for my uncles who were on the ship and studying the a la carte, in a way, if you want to put it spiritually, I've stood on the deck of Titanic. I've walked in the a la carte with them. I've held their hand when I finally found them. And I often think to myself, And as a woman, and as we all know, we call ships she's. I think about Titanic. Here was her maiden voyage. Here was a time that she could show off who she was and why she was created, and why did, you know, J. Bruce Ismay, why was it so important? Why was this ship so important to him? Why was it so important to its builder, Andrew Stevens? Why was it so important to them? And what was the importance of her coming to New York? Why did they choose New York to be its final destination on her maiden voyage? And yet she never got a chance to show her skirts. She never had a chance to show, you know, her absolute beauty and grace that she was given. I mean, I've written a poem. I've written two poems. One Dee read for the first time, and the poem I wrote for the 110th anniversary. And I mean, she sails among the clouds, but who was she? You know, we know her history, we know her grace, we know her love, because obviously we are all in love with her, and she manages to find a way into our hearts. And we cannot forget the Lady of the Sea, the lady who held so many wonderful people, the lady who held my uncles and who cradled them upon their death. I think she really needs to come home. And I really think, because she has never been able to come home here in New York and has never received the reception she needs, the Titanic Memorial Lighthouse has to be her reception home.
Yes, very good.
Because she was never received here. The Carpathia was received with her survivors. And as Adrian, you know, says it so many times, they never had an absolution. They never did, because they came here in pain. They saw family and friends die. And they never received a proper welcome. It was a media circus that day. You know, let's grab a survivor and let's interview them. But do you know what they went through those last hours? But Titanic never, ever had her reception here. And if this lighthouse could be her beacon, her shining beacon up in the heavens, then let it be. Please let it be. And let Margaret Tobin Brown, you know, have her legacy once more. And
yeah, I'd like to remember her birthday yesterday.
Yes.
1867. And all she did on the Carpathia to fundraise for the victims, and what a remarkable woman she was, and that you keep her legacy alive at the Molly Brown Museum. I mean, that's really a wonderful thing that you guys do down there. And when I'm in Denver, I will definitely come visit.
You better.
Yes, please do.
Oh, I'd love to come visit and present anytime, you know. Oh.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Angela and Adrian, for sharing your stories with us, for sharing the incredible work that you are doing in New York and with New York, and for the descendants of Titanic, and for those who passed and survived. We really appreciate you joining us for our Deeper Dive series. It was a really special, special evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go, I'd like to say thank you to Dee. I know I see her on, and you know, she was part of such a special part of my life, helping me, you know, create my book and such. And she's become such a good friend. So I'm really happy. I was really happy to see her here today and see Jill as a part of this presentation. And hi, Pat. I'm glad you're here too. And Adrian, as always, I want to say thank you so much for allowing me, you know, to help you spearhead all of this. It's such a beautiful honor and privilege. Thank you.
Sure. Well, it's not my memorial to my family, it's your memorial to your family and kin. So we're on the journey. And as I said, hopefully we'll have some really good news in the next couple of months.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for joining us. And we have our next deeper dive on August 16th, and we'll get to hear more about some of the Syrian passengers and the Swedish passengers as well. So check out our website where you can find out more information. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. And thank you, Angela and Adrian, so much.
Thank you, Kim and Andrea. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.
Angela, I think I definitely will email you and reach out so we can talk. I would love to hear more about your wonderful foundation and how we can be mutually supportive and partner on that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, because